Constitution cannot be understood apart from its history. There's just no way. From its form to its structure to its text, everything about the Constitution depends upon its time and place in the 18th century world. We should begin by discussing why there was a Constitution in the first place. After all, the United States had a functioning government in 1787, one that had just defeated the greatest power on earth. It had negotiated a peace treaty, and it already had a constitution of sorts, although they were called the Articles of Confederation. There were also state governments, all of whom were clothed in full sovereignty. The Constitution, therefore, promised to uproot all of this, to destroy established interests, and force people that had power to give it up. If this is so, then we have to wonder why American citizens were actually calling for a constitutional convention in 1787. In 1783, with the Revolutionary War won and Americans negotiating the peace settlement in Paris, times were good, right? Wrong. Revolutionary soldiers at an army encampment 7 miles southwest of Newburgh, New York, were threatening a mutiny. The soldiers had not been paid for months. These soldiers were the same common farmers who had risked everything to fight, and many stood to lose their farms back home if they did not return with money to pay their debts. Many had already lost their farms, so we can excuse them for being just a little impatient with Congress, which had repeatedly promised to pay them but never did. Several officers had even suggested that the soldiers should march to Philadelphia and force Congress to act. On March 15th, George Washington visited the soldiers at Newburgh. Now, there was no one more famous in America in 1783 than George Washington, nor any more respected. So when he entered the hall and interrupted General Horatio Gates and asked if he could address the soldiers, no one dared refuse him. There, Washington delivered an oration celebrating the dignity of Republican soldiers, reminding them all of their collective responsibility for virtue as citizens of a peaceful republic. But as Washington looked out on the crowd, it was clear that his words were not moving his audience. Eloquent oratory, even from someone with Washington's gravitas, was certainly not going to be enough. And so, Washington pulled from his pocket a letter from Joseph Jones, a delegate to the Continental Congress. Jones had written him the letter to tell him that he sympathized with the soldiers' plight, and he promised that Congress would immediately attend to the matter. Now, this was the same sorts of promises that had been made time and time again. But Washington picked up the letter and began reading it, but he could barely find his way through it. And in fact, he stumbled over the intro, and picked it back up and started again. And finally, he reaches into his pocket and produced a pair of spectacles. Now, no one had ever seen Washington wear eyeglasses, and nor were they to be found on the nose of any aristocrat, because at the time, glasses were a sign of weakness. So it was with some awe that the soldier saw Washington pull from his pocket the spectacles and place them on his nose. "Gentlemen, you must pardon me," said Washington. "I have grown gray in your service, and now find myself going blind." Washington read the letter, folded it, returned it to his pocket along with his glasses, and left the room. Many of the soldiers had tears streaming down their cheeks as he left. They took a vote after his departure, which resulted in extending Washington thanks and repudiating the officers who had urged them to rebel. The soldiers would wait on Congress. This is a good story. It's an important story for a number of reasons. But the first thing you should notice is that it reveals just how weak was the United States in 1783. If a government has to depend on its greatest general humiliating himself in front of his officers and soldiers just to get their sympathy in order to avoid a military coup, then we aren't far from disaster. There were only so many times Washington could fumble for spectacles before somebody caught on. The real problem was that Congress couldn't pay its debts, and this was because Congress lacked the power to tax under the Articles of Confederation. With no independent revenue, Congress had to go cap in hand to the states and ask for money. This meant that it would always be at the mercy of the states. And this was why the soldiers at Newburgh were ready to march on Congress. Congress couldn't pay its debts. In fact, they had largely paid off the soldiers by issuing them the 18th century equivalent of IOUs. The veterans had risked life and limb for the promise of payment from a government that couldn't keep its promises. And this would come back to bite them. Now, under certain conditions, it might be acceptable for Congress not to have the power to tax, but in this case it raised yet another problem. Congressional power under the Articles of Confederation did not give the Congress any ability to set trade policy, let alone the power to enforce that policy. This meant that the states could undercut one another in attracting foreign trade by throwing open their ports. And this also meant that Congress would have a difficult time conducting foreign policy. Without the ability to use trade as a factor during treaty negotiations, it was unlikely that Congress would be able to make any kind of a good deal. This is not a matter for speculation. The United States supposedly held all the territory east of the Mississippi River, but Spain claimed that it controlled navigation on the Mississippi and threatened to close it to Americans. This would have been disastrous for the farmers who settled west of the Appalachian Mountains, largely in modern-day Kentucky. If the United States could not negotiate a deal, then there was probably going to be war on the frontier. With Spain, would the United States be able to survive while the European empires of Spain, France, and Great Britain circled? Not if they could never negotiate on the same level. These were fatal flaws, and it led many prominent citizens to call for some amendments to the Articles of Confederation. But multiple attempts proved unsuccessful, primarily because of another flaw in the Articles. In order to amend any article within the Articles of Confederation, it had to be approved unanimously by the states. This proved too hard to achieve. To top it all off, the economy was in dire straits in the 1780s. England had closed its ports to American shipping, which was devastating to the export-reliant American economy. This was just as true for farmers as it was for merchants, so everyone felt the pinch. And to make matters worse, Congress passed a requisition in 1785 designed to pay off its public debt and asked each state to meet it. The New England states subsequently quadrupled their taxes, that's quadrupled taxes, in order to pay off this requisition. Massachusetts even demanded that farmers pay it off in hard money, that is, in gold and silver, rather than with paper. Now you have to stop for a minute and realize what this meant for farmers. Farmers had, several years earlier, as soldiers, demanded that their debts be paid. Congress had still not repaid many of the IOUs, leading many of them to have to sell it on the open market to speculators, who bought it up at a much depreciated rate. And now Congress was asking the states to pay back those speculators who held the debt that was once held by the farmers. If this is confusing, just think of it this way. The Revolutionary War veterans were never paid for their service, and now the veterans saw their taxes go up by 400% in order to pay off speculators. As you can imagine, they were not happy with this, and they let their governors know it. Most notably, in 4 western counties of Massachusetts, Revolutionary War veterans organized under the leadership of Daniel Shays. There, they closed down courthouses, stopped the tax collectors, and refused to give up their farms. Shays' rebellion in the winter of 1786 galvanized support for a stronger national government. But it wasn't just that the Articles of Confederation were hopelessly flawed. It was also that the elites were losing control of their people. This was true whether you looked at rebellion in Massachusetts or at the efforts of the Rhode Island legislature to use its state power to cancel the debts of its farmers. Debt relief may have been just. Certainly it was for the farmers. But everybody knew what would happen if Americans just started canceling debts. Their international credit score was going to tank. So there were, needless to say, several incentives to come to Philadelphia in the summer of 1787.